if you read through the entire book of Job in one go, you'll find that the theme of the book is not suffering. This is typically how we apply Job, is Job lost a lot and Job suffered. We're going to start reading in chapter number 1, and we're going to read about halfway into chapter number 2. And from there, we're going to look at the rest of the theme of the book of Job. Chapter number 1, verse number 1, there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was perfect and upright, and one that feared God and eschewed evil. And there were born unto him 7 sons and 3 daughters. His substance also was 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 she-asses, and a very great household, so that this man was the greatest of all the men in the east. And his sons went and feasted in their houses, every one his day, and sent and called for their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. And it was so, when the days of their feasting were gone about, that Job sent and sanctified them, and rose up early in the morning, offered burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, it may be that my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. Thus did Job continually. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them. And the Lord said unto Satan, Whence comest thou? Satan answered the Lord and said, From going to and fro in the earth, from walking up and down in it. The Lord said unto Satan, Hast thou considered my servant Job, that there is none like him in the earth, a perfect and upright man, one that feareth God and escheweth evil? Then Satan answered the Lord and said, Doth Job fear God for naught? Hast thou not made a hedge about him, and about his house, and about all that he hath on every side? Thou hast blessed the work of his hands, and his substance is increased in the land. Put forth thine hand now, and touch all that he hath, and he will curse thee to thy face. The Lord said to Satan, Behold, all that he hath is in thy power. Only upon himself put not forth thine hand. So Satan went forth from the presence of the Lord. And there was a day when his sons and his daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house. And there came a messenger unto Job, and said, The oxen were plowing, and the asses feeding beside them, and the Sabaeans fell upon them and took them away. Yea, they have slain thy servants with the edge of the sword, and I only am escaped alone to tell thee. While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, The fire of God is fallen from heaven, and hath burnt up the sheep and the servants, and consumed them, and I only am escaped alone to tell thee. And while he was yet speaking, there came another and said, The Chaldeans made out 3 bands, and fell upon the camels, and have carried them away, yea, and slain the servants with the edge of the sword. And I only am escaped alone to tell thee. While he was yet speaking, there came also another and said, Thy sons and thy daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house, and behold, there came a great wind from the wilderness, and smote it, the 4 corners of the house, and it fell upon the young men, and they are dead, and I only am escaped alone to tell thee. Then Job arose and rent his mantle, shaved his head, fell down upon the ground, and worshipped, and said, Naked came I out of my mother's womb, naked shall I return thither. The Lord gave, the Lord hath taken away, blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this, Job sinned not, nor charged God foolishly. Again, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them to present himself before the Lord. And the Lord said unto Satan, From whence comest thou? And Satan answered the Lord and said, From going to and fro in the earth, and from walking up and down in it. And the Lord said unto Satan, Hast thou considered my servant Job, that there is none like him in the earth, a perfect and an upright man, one that feareth God and escheweth evil? And still he holdeth fast his integrity, although thou moved me against him, to destroy him without cause. And Satan answered the Lord and said, Skin for skin, yea, all that a man hath he will give for his life. But pour forth thine hand now, and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse thee to thy face. The Lord said unto Satan, Behold, he is in thine hand, but save his life. So Satan went forth from the presence of the Lord, and smote Job with sore boils from the sole of his foot unto his crown. And he took him a potsherd to scrape himself withal, and he sat down among the ashes. Then said his wife unto him, Dost thou still retain thine integrity? Curse God, and die. But he said unto her, Thou speakest, as one of the foolish women speaketh. Shall we receive good at the hand of God? And shall we not receive evil? In all this did not Job sin with his lips. That's the end of the suffering of Job. In a book of 42 chapters, 1.5 chapters in, that part of the story is gone. Scholars a lot smarter than me that have studied it out in the original languages and the structure, and they know more than I ever will, have determined that the book of Job is written as a Hebrew play, which kind of makes sense when you think about the location of the book of Job. You have all of the books of history leading up to, and then you have the books of poetry and of writings, and Job is just kind of stuff right there in the middle. But while it's written as a play, it's written as a play with enough detail that we can conclude that just like a movie would start showing, this is based on a true story. There was a man named Job that suffered the loss of everything. And what we read now is the narrative, dramatized, if you will, version of what happened to real people. And a lot of people will read the book of Job and they begin to think, oh, there's bad things that happen and therefore I'm like Job. No. They look at the bad things that go on in the world and they think that, oh, this is just like Job, and Job was upright and he didn't curse God. It says here twice, Job never sinned against God with his lips. And people think that the suffering and the loss of Job is the theme of the book of Job. But for being the theme of a book, it takes up a chapter and a half out of 42. And so we continue on through the book, reading. The suffering is not the theme. The suffering is the backdrop. The suffering and the loss that Job deals with sets the stage for what's really going on and what's really about to happen. And we get to that at the end of the book. And we'll get to that at the end of the book. But Job, who was the richest of the rich, Job, who owned all of these things, living in the time of the patriarchs, where your wealth was measured in the number of animals that you had and the servants that you had and the size of your household, as they moved around the Middle East grazing. Job would have been the 1% of the 1%. And within a matter of minutes, he lost everything. His cattle were gone, his servants were gone, his house was gone, his family was gone. And Satan says, you know what? He didn't curse you when he did all of that. Touch his body and he'll curse you to thy face. And so Job ends up with boils from the top of his head to the bottom of his feet. About last year or sometime or another, I ended up with about a baseball-sized boil. That is the worst pain that I have ever dealt with in my life. And unlike my wife going through labor, I did not get a baby out of the deal. I just had a boil. And the pain built and the pressure built until such time as it actually blistered over and it could bust the thing and relieve the pressure and relieve the pain. Job is sitting there in a pile of ashes covered head to toe in these things with a piece of broken pottery that he can try to cut it to relieve some of that pressure and to relieve some of that pain. And where Satan has taken everything, this always somewhat amused me. Satan took everything that Job loved, but left his wife. There's a lot of different ways that you could get in trouble with trying to interpret that. And for years, I've heard it preached and I've read it and kind of had this idea that Job's wife was kind of this snarky, bitter, nagging, just curse God and die. But think about it from a place of love and a place of mercy. Watching your spouse having gone through all of that and sitting there covered head to toe in boils, would you not be praying for whatever relief that you could get? Job just ends the pain. We've lost our family. We've lost everything. Just curse God so that you can die and not have to deal with this thing. But Job tells her, thou speakest as one of the foolish women speak. What, shall we receive good at the hand of God, and shall we not receive evil? And in all this, Job sin with his lips. Job has gone from having everything to having nothing. Job has lost his family, his wealth, absolutely everything that he had, that he relied on, despite being an upright man. At the beginning, he's going with his sons feasting and his daughters feasting. He goes and gives a sacrifice for them just on the off chance that maybe they sinned against God and maybe they don't know it. So we'll offer an extra sacrifice just to try to be sure. Job followed what God said repeatedly, and then all of this happens. At the end of chapter number 1, his friends show up. He has 3 friends. There's a 4th younger one that comes in later. But he has 3 friends that show up, and at the end of chapter number 1, they show up and they sit there and stare at him for 7 days. And nobody says anything. If I'm in pain and I've just lost everything and you show up to my house, start speaking. Don't sit there and stare at me for a week. But this is what they did. They showed up. Job is crying. They're all crying. Job is sitting in the ashes. They've put dust all over their heads, and they show up and they sit there and stare at each other for a week. And to be honest, reading the rest of the book, it probably would have been better for them had they just kept silent for the rest of the time that they were there. But in chapter number 3, Job opens his mouth and curses the day that he was born. He says, let the day perish wherein I was born, and the night in which it was said, there's a man-child conceived. Let that day be darkness. Let not God regard it from above, neither let the light shine upon it. Job begins the process of questioning why this is happening. Which, if you've gone through any sort of loss or any sort of tragedy at all, you understand that that's a natural reaction. Why did this happen? Job is looking around and he says, this is terrible. I'm in pain. I wish I was never born, is his whole summation. And then his friends start giving advice. In chapter number 4, Eliphaz answers. Verse 3, behold, thou hast instructed many, and thou hast strengthened the weak hands. Thy words have upholden him that was falling, and thou hast strengthened the feeble knees. And now it has come upon thee, and thou faintest. It touches thee, and thou art troubled. Is this not thy fear, thy confidence, the uprightness of thy ways, and thy hope? Remember, I pray thee, whoever perished being innocent, or where were the righteous cut off? This is a mentality that still exists today. Job, bad things have happened to you. We know that bad things don't happen to good people. He says, is this not thy fear? What you have your hope in is your righteousness. You've been upright and you've obeyed God. And look, God never killed anybody who was good. God never brought destruction on anybody who was good. Bad things don't happen to good people, Job. Good things happen to good people, but here you are suffering. So what does this tell us about Job? And for the next 30-something chapters, it becomes an entire argument between Job and his friends, where Job is defending his righteousness, and his friends are beginning to accuse that surely, because all of this is happening, you must have some secret sin. You remember in the New Testament, who did sin, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Bad things happened to him, therefore somebody sinned. And we take the same mentality a lot of the times. That person got fired from their job. They must have done something wrong. That person lost a family member to whatever it was. God must be judging them. I have heard preached from pulpits as someone is in the hospital dealing with gallstones or whatever the case may be. That cancer in your body is because you weren't faithful enough to church. It's the same mentality as Job's friends. Because you see, if you do good things for God, then God will give you good things. God doesn't give bad things to good people. And that becomes the argument for the next 30-something chapters. Job is standing up and he says, I'm not lying to you. I am upright. I've done what God has wanted me to do. I have followed his instructions. I have sacrificed to him the way that he wanted. I have lived a good life, and you're trying to accuse me of having some hidden sin. Because it's the mentality that, well, bad things don't happen to good people. Job, bad things are happening to you. You must not be good people. One of his friends even goes to accuse his children. Well, your children all died. Obviously, this is judgment of God for sins that they committed. Your training did not do them any good. And this is the story of the book of Job. A man who had everything, a man who had a family, who had riches, who had wealth, and he loses it all. And his friends show up and begin to accuse that, you know what, if you had been doing good things like you really said you would, good things would be happening to you. You've obviously sinned. Something went wrong. And in the beginning, if you read it, go home and read it this afternoon. The entire thing, all in one go. Don't pause at the chapters or the verses. If you read through it, Job starts out with rebuking them. I'm not lying to you. When Eliphaz tells him, did God ever visit this upon the unjust? Yes. Bad people die all the time. Good people die all the time. It rains on the just and the unjust. Naked came I into the world, naked I went out. The Lord giveth, the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. But as the book goes on, Job begins to listen to his friends, and he begins to question not why this is happening, but why God allowed it. When tragedy hits, it's perfectly okay to question why it happened. There's a pastor in Amelia who's one of the few people that I can honestly say fulfilled the biblical definition of a pastor. He loved his people, and he loved the word, and he poured scripture into them. And heading for a Wednesday night service, a maniac comes flying up the road at 100 and something miles an hour and hits him head on. The man is going to church and he died. Obviously, there was some secret sin in his life that God would never do that to a good person. That's the answer of Job's friends. He had preached a message not too long prior. And he says, when tragedy hits, it's perfectly okay to question why it's happened. It's perfectly normal of a human response to wonder, why did God allow this to happen? But where you run into problems, and it's where Job finally crossed the line, is when you begin to believe that God does not have the right to do what he did. Throughout the book of Job, the accusations were made at Job that, you know what, if you were as good as you say you were, good things would be happening to you. You obviously have sin in your life. This is why bad things are happening to you. And Job begins to listen to that. You see his tone change from the beginning of the book. In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. In all this, Job maintained his integrity to the point where his wife looks at him and just for a little bit of relief, if you could just curse God this one time and die and be done with it. But Job didn't listen. By the end of the book, his tune has changed a little bit, where he begins to question whether God had the right to do this to him. Job begins to believe that due to what he has done and his righteousness and his actions, that God does not have the right to allow these things to happen. He begins to question the Almighty. Not questioning the circumstances that he found himself in, he begins to question God. We see that mentality around the world today, and a lot of people will use that as a justification to reject faith entirely or reject the existence of a God entirely, that If there was such a good and loving God, why does he allow all of these bad things to happen? If God was so loving, why in the world is Ukraine being bombed and innocent people dying? If God was so loving, why are people around the world starving to death? If God was so loving and if God was so good, why do we have little girls that are being raped and killed and sold into slavery? Obviously, there's no God. Because those are good people. And God doesn't let bad things happen to good people. And we begin to question not that the bad things happen or why the bad things happen, but we begin to think that, God, you had no right to allow that to happen. These bad things in my life, these problems that we're dealing with, God, you have no right to put that on me. We take that into our personal life. God, I've served you as best I can. God, I've done whatever you've asked me to do. God, I've gone into full-time ministry. God, I've served you where I can. I've worked in the church. I've poured my heart into these kids. I've poured my heart into my family. I've got a wife and kids that I'm trying to provide for, and I'm trying to do the right thing, and I'm trying to grow in grace, and I'm trying to study, and I'm trying to preach, and I'm trying to serve wherever you have me. But God, you just took my job from me. The beginning of the pandemic, I was laid off. March of 2020. Try finding a job when nobody's going to work. 2.5 years later, I still haven't starved to death. God's made a way through it one way or the other. There's been some times where we question how exactly he's going to do that. But at the time, you sit there and you think, and it's very easy to fall into the trap of, God, I've done these things for you. And I'm trying to care for my family. And I'm trying to take care of my kids. But you just took my income. God, I've done all of these good things for you. And you've allowed these bad things to happen. God, you don't have the right to take that from me. That was the line that Job crossed. As he goes through the story, he starts out upright and cemented in his faith. And he knows exactly where he stands before God, and he's doing exactly what he needs to do. He's doing exactly what God asked him, and God is blessing him. And then he loses it all, and still he walks in with the Lord gives and the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. I showed up into this world naked and with nothing, and I'll leave it the same way. But by the end of the book, Job begins to start subscribing to that idea of thinking that because I do good things and because I've served the way that I need to, God owes me good things. That God owes me. Because of my works, God owes me. Because of my dedication, God owes me. Because of my righteousness, God owes me. Because of the way that Job lived, he begins to subscribe to the idea that I've done these things for God. God owes me all of these things and does not have the right to withhold them or take what I have. You read the book of Job and you begin to see that shift in his arguments, where he begins to stand up and say that due to my righteousness, he actually makes the statement, I will demand of God an answer. Because of my righteousness and because of the good things that I do, God owes me good things. And we see this mentality even around on a spiritual level. I was at a funeral of a man who never really went to church, had no faith life to speak of, but he was a good boy. He'd give you the shirt off of his back. He'd help you when you needed it. And because of this, he's sitting on the side of a field somewhere in heaven, watched a buck roll by. Because he did good things, God owes him. And we know people that take that mentality. That because I do good things and that I live a good life according to my standard, which is a whole other message. According to what I believe is a good life and what I believe is righteousness and what I believe, never mind what God says or does, I think I'm a pretty good person. And based on my standard of living, God owes me not only good things, but God owes me heaven. Because of how I live, God owes me. We know people that have taken that approach to life and they begin to think that due to the things that I do and the things that I give and the things that I sacrifice, that God will be pleased. It's the thought that counts doesn't count when it comes to the things of God. God says what his standard is. God says what he demands of you. God is crystal clear in his word that perfection is the standard. Now, I'm not perfect, nowhere close. But according to me, I'm not a terrible person. I try to do more good than I do bad. I try to help more people than I hurt. I haven't killed anybody recently. Therefore, God owes me. And that's the mentality that we see in our world today, that, you know what, the Bible is just a book of morals and it's got some good things in it that we can pull out. And the only part of the Bible that we need is these 3 words, love thy neighbor, and these other 2, judge not. And there's everything I need to know from Scripture. As long as I'm nice to people, and as long as I don't judge people, by my standard, I'm good, I do good things, therefore God owes me good things, and God owes me heaven. Job is sitting here in a pile of ashes and what's left of everything that he used to own. He's covered head to toe in boils and he's scraping himself with a piece of broken clay, trying to pop those boils open to relieve some of the pressure and to relieve some of the pain. His friends show up to try to comfort him and end up swaying him to the idea that because I've done all of these good things in my life, that God owes me good things in return. That God is unjust in allowing these bad things to happen in my life. That God is unjust in doing what he has just done to me. God is unjust in putting me in this situation where I've had to have 10 funerals of all of my kids. All of my servants are gone. All of my animals are gone. I have absolutely nothing. I'm sitting in a pile of rubble with a potsherd scraping boils. God is unjust in doing this. And when he begins to question the Almighty God, we see God show up. We said before that the book can be broken down as if it's a Hebrew play. We see in scene 1 that we read, where Job loses everything. This sets up the story. We see the dialogue between Job and his friends for 30-something chapters as we go through the book, where Job begins to be persuaded that because of his righteousness and his good deeds and the things that he has done, God owes him good things. That because of my works and my righteousness, God owes me stuff. That because I'm a good person according to my standards, God owes me things. Because, God doesn't do bad things to good people. God doesn't allow good people to suffer. And Job begins to be swayed. In chapter number 38, then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, "Who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge?" Remember before, Job says, "I will demand of God an answer." In verse number 3 of chapter 38, God tells Job, "Gird up now thy loins like a man, for I will demand of thee and answer thou me. Where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? Declare it, if thou hast understanding. Who hath laid the measures thereof, and if thou knowest? Or hath stretched the line upon it? Whereupon are the foundations thereof fastened? And who laid the cornerstone thereof? When the morning stars sang together, for all the sons of God shouted for joy? Or who shut up the sea with doors when it brake forth, if it had issued out of the womb? When I made the cloud and the garment thereof, and thick darkness a swaddling band for it, and brake up from my decreed place, and set bars and doors, and said, hitherto shalt thou come, but no further, and here shall the proud waves be stayed. God looks at Job, where Job begins to get this arrogance that God is unjust in doing this to me. God is wrong for allowing bad things to happen. God's response to Job is, gird yourself up like a man. It's time for you to answer. Where were you when the world was built? Where were you when I drew a line in the sand and told the waves they can't come any further? Where were you when the stars were put out? All of this sums up to a little question that we know a little bit more in the Southern vernacular. God is looking at Job and saying, who do you think you are? You want to demand of me an answer? You want to look at me and think that I am unjust because I allowed these things to happen to you? Where were you when the world was built? And God goes through this series of pointed questions at Job. He talks about the behemoth and the Leviathan. Job attempts to answer. God cuts him off. He's like, no, you had your turn talking. You want to ask all these things of me. You want to accuse me of being unjust. You're going to stand up. God tells him twice, gird yourself up like a man. I will demand of thee an answer. This is God's response to Job. This will be the closing scene. In scene 1, we see the suffering and the loss that Job goes through. In scene 2, we see Job begin to progress to this idea that, you know what, I did good things and God owes me good things in return. And in scene 3, God steps on the scene and asks Job, who do you think you are? I want you to stand up like a man, and you're going to answer me. That's God's response. He begins to tell him in chapter 41, canst thou draw out Leviathan with a hook, or his tongue with a cord which thou lettest down? Canst thou put a hook into his nose, or bore an awl through with a thorn? Will he make many supplications unto thee? Will he speak soft words unto thee? Will he make a covenant with thee? Wilt thou ever take him for a servant forever? Wilt thou play with him as with a bird? Wilt thou bind him for thy maidens? And he goes on and on and on. God says, I have created absolutely everything and you in it. And you want to talk to me like that? Kind of sounds like a response that one might give a toddler. I make you, and I give you life. And you're going to talk to me like that? Job begins to get the idea that he is somebody. Job begins to get, another Southern phrase for you, gets a little big for his britches. Until Job is standing up, pointing at an almighty, holy, just God and saying, I've done good things. You owe me. I've done good things. I will demand of you an answer. I've lived righteously and I've sacrificed in excess. I gave sacrifices for my children just in case they had sinned against you. I have done everything you've asked of me. You've allowed this to happen. You had no right to do this to me, God. If Job had stayed where he started, with naked came I into the world, and naked will I return. The Lord gives and the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. If Job had stayed there, he would have been okay. But Job begins to get this mentality that, you know what, I've done good things, and due to my good works, God owes me stuff. God steps on the scene and throws it all back in Job's face. Where Job tells God that I will demand of God an answer. God tells Job twice, gird up your loins like a man, I will demand of you an answer. And at that point, Job realized who he was. Through all of this, Job thought he was somebody. Job thought that he was just in demanding an answer of God. Job thought that he was just in going through this, and yes, he's lost things, and yes, he had the funerals, and yes, all of this happened to him, and it's bad and it's tragic, and we as humans, we understand that loss. If you've ever stood by a graveside as you buried somebody, you understand that loss. If you've ever sat in a hospital room wondering if somebody's going to pull through, you understand that loss. If you've ever had the doctor tell you that one piece of news that you hope no one on earth ever hears again, you understand that loss. And Job says, the Lord gives, and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Because we are creation. And the creation has no right to demand of the Creator. The creation has no right to tell the Creator, you have no right treating me this way. But Job gets through, and he begins to be persuaded in his mind that he is somebody and that he has the right to stand up to God, that even though he's lost everything and he starts out well and he starts out not sitting with his lips, but Job finally comes to the point where he thinks that he is somebody and thinks that he has the right to stand up and point to God and say, you're going to answer to me for what you did. God turns around to Job. He says, no, you're going to answer me. Where were you when I built all of this? Where were you when I set the world on its foundations? It's absolutely incredible. The earth is 93 million miles and change from the sun, the exact distance that it needs to be from the sun that we have to sustain light and heat enough to cause everything to grow, but not to cook it all and not to freeze it all. It's amazing how perfectly that slide is. The earth is set on a 23.5 degree axis, which means it kind of wobbles while it moves. And because of that wobble, we get seasons. Right now, we're going into winter. The top half of the wobble is starting to move away from the sun. It's amazing how that works. We have a weird rock that's floating around the earth that we get to see at nighttime through the reflection of the sun that is the perfect distance away from the earth that it needs to be to pump the ocean. And as it pumps the ocean, it's pumping oxygen into the atmosphere that we're able to breathe. Weird. If that moon was any closer, the tides would be so much we'd get a tsunami twice a day and it would kill everybody on Earth. If the moon was not there or too far away, the water would become stagnant and the oceans would not have waves and everybody would die. It's amazing how that works. Then we get that one little phrase in the beginning of Genesis with, and he made the stars also. You walk out on a clear night, we'll look up at the absolute beauty of the night sky with the stars stretched across. And all that Genesis has to say about that is, he made the stars also. It's amazing how that works. God arranged building codes and definitions of life built into DNA in your body that tells you how exactly that you're going to grow. It's weird. Science tries to explain it. But the chance encounter of having all that information being passed on to a single organism, much less two organisms that can somehow make more organisms. And one of those organisms has the gall to stand up and point at the Creator. Say, you owe me. The Creator's response is, did you build this? Did you make all this? Who do you think you are to look at the one who set the earth exactly the distance from the sun that it needed to be, that you didn't cook or freeze? And he set this moon around the earth exactly where it needed to be, that you didn't starve to death. And you want to look at me and say, I owe you? You want to look at me and say that I don't have the right to let bad things happen to you? We take this mentality that I do good things, therefore God owes me, and we take it to the extent of the supernatural that God owes me heaven. If we could ever get this one little thought through our head, God doesn't owe you anything. God doesn't owe you anything. He doesn't owe you this building to meet in, the home that you're going back to, the transportation that you have that brought you here, the nice clothes that you have, the breath you're taking. God doesn't owe you anything. But here's the flip side. God gave you everything. The sovereign, almighty creator of every spawn gave you everything. We have creation to enjoy, and we've come through autumn where all of the leaves just turn beautiful colors. And we get to enjoy that. You know, God could have just created leaves to turn brown, fall off, hit the ground, and die. But he didn't. Weird. He made leaves. In the death of a maple leaf or an oak leaf, he made them absolutely beautiful, such that we have people that take trips to the mountains specifically to see the turning of the colors of the leaves. God didn't have to do that. But above all of creation, God gave you his son. God owes you nothing, but he gave you his son, that whosoever believeth on him should not perish, but have everlasting life. Where others are sitting out there thinking that because of the good things that I have done, God owes me heaven, we can say, God doesn't owe me anything, but through his son and the blood and the death on the cross, God has given me everything. I don't have to demand of God an answer of why did you allow these things to happen to me. You haven't come anywhere close to what his son dealt with. Your suffering and your loss hasn't come anywhere close to the suffering and loss and the death on the cross. But we want to stand up when something happens in life and think, you know what, God, you didn't have the right to take them from me. You didn't have the right to do this to me. You didn't have the right to put me through this. God, you're wrong for doing this to me. That was the point that Job came to. And God speaks to Job. And he says, who do you think you are to demand of me an answer? You're going to gird yourself up like a man and you're going to answer me. Did you create any of this? It's the story of an atheist who began to mock God and to think, you know what, mankind has come to the point with science that we can do anything that God can do. God's like, all right, let's have a competition. Let's make a person. Atheists like, yeah, we can do that. We know enough evolution and chemistry in the lab. We can create life the same way that God can. God bends down up the dust and makes a man. Atheists like, I can do that. He bends down, starts scraping together the dirt, and God says, no. You go make your own dirt. We have this mentality as creation that we are allowed to demand an answer of the Creator. That was God's response to Job. And Job at the very end, in chapter number 42, told you we'd get there. Then Job answered the Lord and said, I know that thou canst do everything and that no thought can be withholden from thee. Who is he that hideth counsel without knowledge? Therefore have I uttered that I understood not, things too wonderful to me which I knew not. Hear, I beseech thee, and I will speak. I will demand of thee, and declare thou unto me. I have heard of thee by the hearing of the ear, but now might I see thee. Job got to the point where he realized who he was before God. He realized who God was. And he says, I've heard of you, and I somewhat knew of you, but now I see you. Be very careful. No matter what happens in life, no matter the struggles that we go through, and the problems that we face, and the trials that we face, and the loss and the suffering that we may think is the subject, but it may just be the backdrop, so that we can come to the point where we know God, but now we see him. We've heard of God, but through the suffering and the problems that we're facing, we can say, like Job, I've heard of thee, but now I see.